السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين محمد بن عبد الله وآل بيته وصحبه أجمعين. أخواني وأخواتي من التربويين والمختصين ومدراء المدارس والمعلمين، السادة الحضور المشاركين في سلسلة 90 دقيقة من المعرفة التربوية في انطلاقتها الأولى حول موضوع مدارس المستقبل. يأتي تنفيذ وتنظيم هذه السلسلة لتعكس التعاون المشترك والمستمر بين المركز الإقليمي للتخطيط التربوي والمؤسسات التربوية والتعليمية ممثلة بكلية الإمارات للتطوير التربوي، في إطار شراكة استراتيجية نسعى من خلالها لتقديم الدعم والمساندة للأنظمة التعليمية والعاملين فيها في وطننا العربي، من خلال تبادل الخبرات والاطلاع على أفضل الممارسات وتبني السياسات التعليمية الداعمة لتطوير التعليم في أوطاننا. السادة الحضور والمشاركين، هذه السلسلة تنفذ في فترة لازال العالم والأنظمة التعليمية تعاني من تأثيرات جائحة كوفيد-19 ويسعى جاهداً للتكيف معها والتعافي، وتم اختيار موضوع الندوة ليتوائم مع مخرجات مشاريع البحث بالمركز الإقليمي للتخطيط التربوي ومع آخر المستجدات العالمية وأولويات التعليم، وللاستعداد لفترة ما بعد الجائحة من خلال تطوير السياسات ونماذج العمل على المستوى الاستراتيجي والتشغيلي في المؤسسات التعليمية والمدارس. السادة الحضور، أن تأثيرات الجائحة على الأنظمة التعليمية والتسارع الذي حدث في التوجه نحو التكنولوجيا واستثمارها في ضمان عملية استمرار التعلم لكل الطلبة سوف يعمل على تغيير وتطوير النظرة المستقبلية للمدارس وآليات عملها وأدوار جميع العاملين ضمن المنظومة المدرسية، حيث أن التقنية حتماً ستغير ملامح التعليم. فالدراسات الاستشرافية لمستقبل التعليم تتنبأ بسيناريوهات يغيب عنها التعليم التقليدي الذي نعرفه في وقتنا الحاضر، وسوف يؤثر ذلك على جميع مكونات البيئة المدرسية، بما يدعم أنواع التعلم المستقبلية التي نتجت عن الجائحة أو سوف تظهر بعدها بشكل يتناسب مع التطورات الاجتماعية والاقتصادية والتكنولوجية التي سوف تحصل في المستقبل. وسوف يتم خلال هذه الجلسة التي تمتد ل90 دقيقة مشاركتكم بتصور حول مدارس المستقبل وطرح الآراء وتبادل الخبرات من الخبراء المشاركين في الجلسة، وسوف تكون لآرائكم وخبراتكم كل التقدير، لذا نرجو منكم عرضها في قائمة الأسئلة والأجوبة لنتشارك فيها. وفي نهاية كلمتي أتقدم بالشكر لجميع الشركاء الاستراتيجيين للمركز الذين شاركوا في تنفيذ هذه الجلسة، وأشكركم على مشاركتكم وتفاعلكم. وانتقل الآن إلى شريكنا الاستراتيجي الدائم كلية الإمارات للتطوير التربوي، فليتفضل الدكتور إبراهيم الحجري مدير عام الكلية بتقديم الكلمة الافتتاحية. تفضل دكتور.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. شكرا سعادة مهرة المطيوعي مدير المركز الإقليمي للتخطيط التربوي، ويسعدنا اليوم شخصيا ممثل كلية إمارات التطوير التربوي بكادرها الأكاديمي والإداري والطلبة المنتسبين إليها أن ننضم إليكم اليوم في هذا المحفل، ودائما أنتم مبدعين ما شاء الله ببرامجكم اللي تطرحونها في المجال التربوي، ونطاق الانتفاع منه نطاق كبير جدا، ونحن سعيدين أن نكون جزء من هذا المحفل اليوم. اسمحوا لي أتكلم باللغة الإنجليزية إذا سمحتوا. نتكلم عن موضوع برنامج القيادات. هذا برنامج تعمل عليه الكلية لتطوير القيادات المدرسية.
ترجمة موجودة.
تمام. Good afternoon everyone, and thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to give this keynote short talk on behalf of Emirates College for Advanced Education, where we do make sure that theory is put in place for application. Studies within local context that is brought from an international perspective are always a methodology that we follow. today we are happy also to announce that Emirates College for Advanced Education has received international accreditation from Ziva for 6 years in a row. Ziva is an international accrediting agency from Germany under the European Accreditation Organization, which is well known and renowned, and this is for all our programs. To top the success, of course, we've started to work with the different stakeholders led by the Ministry of Education, with its different teams, also in association with the Emirates School Establishment. We have constructed a team that consists of experts in the field of school leadership from local and international venues. Locally, we are collaborating with UAE University, Zayed University, HCT, experts also on the field, staff and employees from the ministry and Emirates School of Establishment, as well as international faculty, to create a leadership framework program that hopefully will see the light in the near future once it goes through the right rigorous also reviews and approvals. This program will add value to the improvement of a system-wide in the education in UAE. We know that there are great programs offered to teachers, great professional development that is offered also by the Emirates establishment, school establishment to their teachers. I think the missing, most important also second piece of the puzzle are to focus also on school leadership. And this is where we have put together a team of experts to look at international practices and contextualize those experiences and best practices and benchmarking to the UAE context and environment. A framework that would fit our needs, the aspirations of the country leaders to elevate the education in UAE to be in the top countries in the world. And this is how we are approaching the design of the new leadership framework. The framework meets the local leadership, school leadership standards that was approved by the Ministry of Education. We are working closely with the standards team, the magnificent team at the MOE, as well as we're working very closely with the assessment team in the MOE. We're working with school leaders, school experts to make sure that we don't leave a stone unflipped when it comes to creating this program. This program hopefully will add again value to UAE, and hopefully we will be able to reflect and improve in this program as we see it, inshallah, unfold. And we will be very happy to share this expertise through the RECEP to other countries in the region. We will be very happy also to share our expertise in the different areas that we have at ECE to the region. Happy to be here again. We look forward to unleashing and this program in the future and presenting it to you all in the future, inshallah. And if any of you have any questions about it or concerns or would like to also share their expertise, we are very happy to collaborate and open our hearts before our minds to your contribution. Thank you again, and wishing you a very successful day, inshallah, today. Thank you.
شكرا دكتور إبراهيم، شكرا دكتور إبراهيم على هذه الكلمة التي أعطتنا صورة حول ما تقوم به كلية الإمارات للتطوير التربوي من جهد في إعداد قادة المدارس. وطبعا مدارس المستقبل لن تصلح إلا بيد قادتها، فبالتالي يجب أن نطور ونؤهل هذه الفئة العام المهمة في المجال التربوي، لأن على أساسهم أنا دائما أقول المعلم والمدير المدرسة هم أساس التطوير، بالتالي يجب أن نختار ونؤهل الكفاءات الخاصة للقيام بهذا الدور. ننتقل الآن إلى الدكتورة هنا، سوف تدير الحوار. أقدم الدكتورة هنا. دكتورة هنا الغالي an expert at the World Bank, working closely on peripheral states including Lebanon and Iraq. She is also working on pressing issue and territory education policy in the MENA and the Middle East and North Africa, addressing issues such graduate employability, benchmarking of governments across institute of territory education, and mapping finance trend across the sector. She has also engaged in development projects with the World Bank in India, Algeria, Egypt, and Jordan. Dr. Al-Ghali was recently the program director of the Program of Education and Youth Policy Research at the Issam Fares Institute of Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, and a lecturer at the University Department of Education. She is lead research project across the MENA region on education policy, focusing on issue of access in basic education, equity and territory education, and higher education for refugees. She is also member of Higher Education Reform Expert, advising the Director General of Higher Education at the Ministry of Education and Higher Education in Lebanon. In 2013, she was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship to the University of Georgia, where she researched and implemented trends among the educate women in Lebanon and Qatar. Dr. Al-Ghali also serves as the MENA region co-editor for the Comparative and International Higher Education, the journal for the Higher Education Specialist Interest Group for the Comparative and International Education System. دكتورة هنا تفضلي.
السلام عليكم. شكرا أستاذة مهرة، شكرا للحضور وشكرا لآرسب لتنظيم هذه الجلسة المهمة. وبطبيعة الحال يعني موضوع في مثل ما بنقول نحن بوقته تمام، خاصة بوضع الذي يمر فيه العالم وقطاع التربية في جميع البلدان. فنحن يعني في مرحلة لابد من أن نتحدث عن موضوع مستقبل التعليم ومستقبل المدارس، وما هي المدارس المستقبلية التي نراها لكي تتماشى مع الوضع الحالي حول العالم، وطبعا ذلك بسبب تأثير البانديميك، ولكن أيضا هناك تأثيرات أخرى. So now I will switch to English, but I know that there's translation if needed. So again, I'm thanking everyone for this session and for ARSEP for hosting this event. So to jump right into today's topic and discussion, we know very well that societal engagement and innovation are key to individual and community well-being. Today, our societies face challenges pertaining to equity, technology, and the economy, and the changing markets. And this is all over the world. And all of these have been quite aggravated by the impact of the pandemic, and which are reflected in the education sector's needs to reorient towards individual learning. So the thing is that we can no longer, I think what the pandemic gave everyone is a realization that we can no longer do business as usual. We can no longer go about schooling, teaching, learning, or life as we used to in 2019, perhaps. Today's panelists will discuss how schools of the future need to promote societal integration and equity by developing the growth of individuals through lifelong learning for all, which allows for engagement in communities. Through today's discussion, we will explore how schools moving forward must develop lifelong learners capable of critical thought who engage in their communities. To support individual growth within sustainable societies, our panelists will discuss a model of flexible, portable, individualized lifelong learning for all, supported by artificial intelligence and big data, and one that incorporates community collaboration. And what is quite interesting in our discussion today is that the discussion will not only address pedagogical issues related to teaching and learning in the classroom or within the school itself, but we will also discuss or touch upon issues related to design, the physical appearance of the schools as well. Through school community integration, this model that is going to be discussed today aims to promote schools as animators of knowledge growth that serve learning for all, well-being, and emotional social aspects for the individual to the community level. With this brief overview of today's discussion, I will introduce our first speaker. So just to give you a brief idea of how today's event is going to go, we will have our speaker, Dr. Claudine Habat, present the proposed model for the School of the Future. And then we'll have esteemed guests comment on this perspective. And of course, we will welcome questions from the audience. If you do have a question, please type it up on the chat, and we will make sure to reflect your question and address it to the presenters. So with that, we will start with Dr. Claudine. Dr. Claudine is a cognitive neuroscientist and psychophysicist, specializing in perceptual cognitive processing and its development across the lifespan, with a focus on how context interacts with perception and cognition, and their applications to the educational environment. She is an associate professor of counseling, special education, and neuroscience at the Emirates College of Advanced Education, where she co-wrote the program in education and neuroscience and co-founded the Cognitive Neuroimaging Unit. Dr. Claudine, we're all very excited for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hannah. It's a pleasure to be here. So first, I'd just like to say thank you, shukran to everyone, and hello and salam alaikum. So here we go. Sorry, I just need to share the screen. Sorry about that.
Just click and share screen, the green one.
Yes, thank you. My image was collapsed. Okay, here we go.
Okay, we can see your presentation.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you.
So we're in a changing world. So for example, this meeting is currently online, and that's considered perfectly normal, whereas just over a year ago, it would not have even been imaginable. So how can we prepare for a future of unknowns? Well, what we can do is plan for the skills that provide us with the flexibility and agility to meet the needs of a changing landscape. Okay. Now, what are these skills? What could we implement? So this is a depiction of the future school from a 19th century depiction for what they imagined the year 2000 to look like. So of course, this is what we don't want to do. We don't want to mince information and just feed it with no thought as this image shows. What we want to do is foster thinking. So in order to get there, let's look at our roadmap for today. So this is what the points we're going to look at today. So of course, we do face challenges and needs, okay? And we think we can address them through lifelong learning and flexibility, all right? So we're proposing a community integrated holistic school model with the technology to support this flexibility integrated within that. So, and then we'll take a look at what this would look like, what this means on a daily basis, and finally address some challenges and recommendations, okay? So, here we have some of the main challenges that we face, all right? So we've got a series of related challenges that we face that involves social inequalities, inconsistencies between technological demands of the workplace and those addressed in schools. We've got to work with teams that are cross-cultural, and this specific aspect has been accelerated with the pandemic. And of course, we also face social fragmentation. Now, the social fragmentation aspect is interesting because currently, with the amounts of easily accessible information online, we would expect more room for people to interface. But what we're seeing a lot of is reliance on social media feeds and biased sources that only increase the divide. So, and this brings us back to that image of just thoughtlessly feeding information. So we want to move away from that and look towards something larger. So to address the issues, we have integrated needs that tackle these challenges, okay? And our main points are to look at diversifying how we're learning and incorporating the need to be engaged in that learning and in society. So the way to do that is to foster lifelong learning and curiosity, to really, encourage that sense of curiosity, along with empathy. Empathy is important in this case because we need to understand other people's perspectives if we're working in, if we're looking for a more integrated society. So Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's an astrophysicist with quite a bit of interest in the human condition in general, said, has a quote that really embodies this beautifully. And basically that his two main philosophies are to know more today about the world than I knew yesterday and lessening the suffering of others. You'd be surprised how far that gets you. So that really summarizes the point quite beautifully. So in looking at the future of education, the OECD have suggested that we need to support individualized learning through collaboration and technological support. We need to involve various sectors of society and to make sure that our schools are connected with our communities. Now, all of this, of course, through a flexible, portable learning approach. So the actions we need to take are to develop the technological and social skills to support adaptability and the information literacy, to develop information literacy through critical evaluation. Okay. So let's look now at how education can come in. So education, of course, can support us, is a powerful tool in accomplishing these things. And what we have is education can help us develop and teach and learn critical evaluation, which can help with social equity. And alongside with that, to learn the social emotional skills and the technology skills needed to respond to future changes. So that's the what we need to develop. How do we get there? Okay, and that's where we're looking at the idea of a community integrated holistic school. Okay, now the purpose of this type of environment is to provide learning experiences for all, and the idea of a learning experience as opposed to just learning in general is quite important because we want people to feel their learning. We don't want it to just be a process that you just go through. It needs to be lifelong so that we can all grow, all of the members of our community can grow. And, we need for that the flexibility, the portability, and bring that all together to promote social involvement. So our school has three main pillars that make up the school. We've got the idea of a physical destination. And so, the word destination here is important because it's not just a location, it's not just a place to be, it really is a go-to destination. That's the embodiment that we want here. We've got a rich intellectual environment, and of course, social and emotional well-being are a huge part of that because we can't really thrive without that learning how to be well, socially and emotionally. So these are our three pillars. Now, we need to use community partnerships and research along with the support from artificial intelligence and big data to get there in order to deliver this flexible learning, okay, in an adaptive, innovative, and agile setting. That's what we're aiming for, okay? So what does our community integrated entity look like, okay? So we've got this image here, but what we have is at the center, we have our school as a community hub, okay? And it's got partnerships with our community at large, okay? And industry. So industry is important because it not only offers possible financial resources, but it also offers placement opportunities for some of those learning experiences that we're talking about. The same goes for universities, where, again, it's not just about the possible placement opportunities, but it's also that flow between advancement, scholarly advancement and other types of advancement with the school. So we want that to be a two-way road. And we've seen a lot of that in recent years with the brain sciences, but it's really been at the level of individual schools and individual universities having partnerships and using the brain sciences to promote learning at the school level. So if that were in a more formal structure, we would be able to see more of that system-wide. We also have partnerships with foundations, which allow not only for a volunteering infrastructure, but it also allows us to connect communities for the societal needs of the community. Now, why do we want all of this involvement? Okay, so all of this involvement is important because it allows us to develop more better rounded students who are well-rounded, who are better prepared to enter the workplace and their communities with the ability to contribute immediately, okay? There's less of a lag in terms of possible contribution. Now, the power of this type of framework is that it allows everyone to evolve synergistically. It's not just the schools or just the market force working independently on things. It allows for this synergistic exchange and development. So that's why we're looking at this coordinated type approach for the integration. So why does integration matter? Well, simply put, integration matters because we get out what we put into something. So there's been quite a bit of evidence showing that youth who experience community rotations tend to give back more as adults. So we get this beneficial cycle that continues and that supports our development, not just as individuals, but as a society as well. So what do we need to do to support holistic growth? So we've seen that we've got the structures that we looked at, but we also need to look at social emotional health and well-being. So it's important because we're living in an increasingly demanding world, okay? So, and chronic stress is everyone's exposed to it. It's not just working adults, it's affecting people at all ages, okay? And it can affect different ages differently. So unfortunately, some of the effects are quite detrimental. We can have, effects on brain function, cognitive processing, learning, and many other aspects. These are just some of the ones that are a little more tied to education. So what can we do? What can we do for that? Well, we all need to learn coping mechanisms, okay? We all need to learn coping mechanisms and to support our well-being. So, and having that integrated in schools is a very useful tool to developing that and supporting that long-term, all right? So now to pull all of these aspects together, okay, support from technology is useful here. So we want to look at how technology can help us. And basically the key point, the main purpose for having technology integrated here is that it can help us personalize the learning experience, which is our end goal, okay? And it's a very powerful tool in the quest to transform education, okay? So in order to get there, we need to look at some of the technological tools available, which of course involve understanding data a little better amongst other things, okay? So here, for example, we've got big data exists at various scales, types, sizes, timelines. It really, the whole range is there. And we've got two main types of big data. And so that we've got the structured type, which for example, is something you'd see in your standard spreadsheet, versus unstructured, which is the type of data that comes in on social media and type of information. But that allows us to build a very interesting portrait of learning. We can look at a wide range, an exhaustive range of things, and also get a fine-grained view of various aspects. So now let's look at how how this can be implemented, okay? And that's where we need to have artificial intelligence applications for education, to use these data for education. So in this context, artificial intelligence can help us develop AI-based personal tutoring tools. It can be used as an assessment tool. It's very useful in providing real-time feedback to students so they can really exercise a bit of range of motion in their learning at that point. It allows for the flexibility to learn anytime, anywhere, okay? It gives us, because of that individualized customization aspect that AI can help us accomplish, it obviously provides support for students with learning difficulties who need to follow a more specific path. It gives us the ability to have virtual guides and facilitators in a more, game-based type learning environment. And of course, it's not just what it offers the individual student, but also it can be used as a system level analysis approach and evaluation tool, okay? And prediction tool as well. So there are many, many various aspects that AI can support us with. Now, how is all this technology integrated in the school of the future? Okay, so what does the school of the future look like? So we need to start by remembering that we want our school of the future to use artificial intelligence to provide that flexibility, which so we can encourage personal growth of the individual within a community, okay? And this, of course, supports our human aspects. That's what we want to make sure that humanity is supported here. Now, so this setup is basically creating an adaptive, innovative, and agile environment, okay, that uses technology to serve all stakeholders. So what does the world look like? What does daily life look like for our individuals in the ecosystem? Okay, so we have students, okay, what they can experience is, they can have access to these community integrated experience. They have the options to select modules according to their interest. And of course, now when we're talking customization, assessment is no longer sitting in a classroom and getting a grade on a test or a project. So how do we keep track of the students' progress and maintain that continuity across the customization? So that's where the AI tools can help us with that. And students can see their own progress, okay, and adjust their own goals. So that fosters responsibility. So students can become more responsible for their own learning and become self-advocates or learn to become self-advocates. So that's the student aspect. For teachers, what daily life looks like is that the AI would allow for, it would allow to give teachers back the art of teaching, okay, to really, with a lot of the day-to-day, the reports and things like that handled by the AI, then they'd be able to focus on the creative development of the learner and really serve as facilitators, coaches, guides in learning, which would, promote that positive attitude towards learning. Now, in terms of, it also can support teachers in developing their own skills, their own soft skills or other skills that they'd like to work on. And of course, by having a more comfortable, competent teacher, that goes back to our students as well. So it's again, maintaining that cycle. Now, for school leaders and administrators, again, because the AI systems can cover many of the little day-to-day operations, okay, so our school administrators and leaders can look at, program effectiveness, at the challenges that are coming about, at how engagement is progressing. So they can look at all of these factors, and because the day-to-day is handled, then they can focus on creating rapport, not only within the school, but also with the communities to really have that, to be facilitators in that integration. For policymakers, they can, of course, it allows policymakers to evaluate entire frameworks and invite comments from all stakeholders, which in the past, even if you had all that data come in, it would be very difficult to analyze and interpret it without some tools, which we now have access to. So these are examples of the day-to-day for various stakeholders. We, of course, have parents in the community at large, okay? Now, for parents, it's very useful because they'd be able to view their child's real-time progress as opposed to receiving intermittent reports, okay? And because of the sophistication and the integration, you'd be able to look at how, as a parent, our involvement is affecting our child's growth, what types of learning activities they flourish in, and basically what are the factors with which, you know, the child does better or not. And a third aspect, which we often talk about teacher professional development, and we forget that parents actually need parental professional development as well, especially with different approaches and the way things are progressing. Then this would also give parents the tools to look and see where they could develop in certain areas to better support their children. And of course, we've got the interaction with the community at large, where having the AI systems can help us match learners with the particular interests and the learning experiences out there. So this just summarizes the various aspects, and what the future of learning looks like is basically this coordinated approach across the ecosystem. That's what all of these suggestions allow us to do. Now, of course, as with we've got, you know, challenges to look at, and as with any new endeavor, okay, the challenges are similar to any new endeavor in many ways. We've got policy needs, strategy needs. We need to, you know, plan for resources, coordinate across priorities and stakeholders. And the added item here is ethical concerns. Because of the big data, we need to make sure that we ensure privacy and equity, because to implement this well, we want to make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind. And of course, again, the whole point is to make sure that the whole point of this is to improve our human aspect. So just to make sure that doesn't get lost in the tech integration. Now, how can we address these challenges? There are many, and how can we implement this framework? So there are many ways to address it and move forward. And the key aspect is to have a coordinated approach to overcome the challenges. Now, what the pandemic has shown us is that flexibility is possible. Okay, it really has helped us accelerate and realize that. And in order to follow through on the implementation, we need to maintain the momentum of coordination that we're experiencing right now to support our societal development through this type of school structure. So thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Claudine. This is quite interesting, and I personally have a lot of questions, but I will save them till a little bit later to ask you a little bit more about this kind of model and how it fits in different contexts. You know, given that, you know, the differences that exist around the world. But we'll keep this discussion for a little bit later. Now I move to our other guests, who are going to be kind of projecting on this and reflecting on this presentation. And we will start with Dr. Harry Daniels. Dr. Daniels is a professor of education at Oxford University. He is the editor of Emotional and Behavioral Difficulties. In the past, he was a deputy head teacher in a special school and taught mathematics and science in mainstream settings. He has taught at the universities of London, Bath, Birmingham, where he was professor of special education and educational psychology. He has directed more than 40 research projects. Dr. Daniels' extensive publications include a series of internationally acclaimed books in sociocultural psychology. His current research projects concern children who are excluded from school and the implications of new school design for children's experience of schooling. Quite timely discussions, I can imagine. He is the research professor at the Institute for Learning Sciences at the Australian Catholic University. He's also an adjunct professor at the Center for Learning Research, Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. He's also a research professor at Center for Human Activity Theory at Kansai University, Osaka, Japan. And he was a research professor in cultural historical psychology in Moscow State University of Psychology and Education. Dr. Daniels, we are very eager to hear your perspective on the model that has been presented in terms of the schools for the future. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. At the outset, I must emphasize that Hao Ming Se and I have spoken, and we're going to run our session together, and I will talk through the issues that we'd agreed to talk about, rather than trying to swap between us, which might be somewhat uncomfortable. I'm going to share the screen, if I can do that. Yep. And can you see now the slides?
Yes, see it. Yes.
Yep. Right. I think what we're addressing is what the school of the future will look like, which is the second of your questions. And this is concerned with both the physical environment and the way in which the practice of education proceeds. Now, in our project, which started in 2013, we came to the view that actually thinking of design as distinct from practice wasn't terribly helpful. And we also came to the view that design alone will not transform practice. Far too often, certainly in England, we've witnessed policies, the introduction of policies which informed teachers they were now going to have to work in a different way. And quite often they didn't. Our suggestion is that if we want people to work in a different way, for example, rather than having 30 children in a classroom who they were responsible for on their own, having many more children in a much larger, more flexible, agile, open space, then they were going to have to learn how to do that because it is a different form of work. And we're going to show some evidence of where, unfortunately, that doesn't always work. Now, there's a sort of shopping list of innovations which people quite often articulate in terms of the future of schooling, of personalized learning, of project-based learning, thinking about clusters of curriculum subjects rather than being highly boundaried from each other, of high levels of community engagement, of leadership being distributed within and across schools, of of clusters or chains of schools, and the idea of there being schools within schools, but no longer just seeing one school of maybe 2,000 children, they're having a much more flexible unit of organization. And this was taken from a local authority that Hao Ming Se and I worked with for 3 years. And they said, well, what are we trying to do by the introduction of new designs? And they said, we're trying to move from dedicated formal spaces for learning to much more flexible and informal ones. And we think we can do that by the introduction of new spaces. Well, this was a design of one of their schools. And you can see it's got large areas and breakout smaller areas, lots of variation in the types of learning spaces that would be available. And what was interesting about this school was that the head teacher, before the new school was built, set up a practice area in the old school so that her teachers could work with her to develop a way of working with this new, let's think of the design as a tool. If you're wanting to achieve certain things, if you were doing any kind of work, you have tools with which to do that work. And thinking of the design as a tool, actually just being donated it's like someone giving you a new computer and you don't know the software. you won't instantly be working fluidly. You've got to learn how to use it. And in this school, she set about organizing, learning how to use the building, learning how to teach in a different way over a long period of time. And every Thursday, I think it was, everybody who works in that school, they meet together to talk about how the development of their work is going and what they need to be doing next. In other words, cycles of learning are built into the way in which effectively the design evolves. And this is a picture of that space in action. And you have it's about 5 teachers in this space. If you could see the whole of the space, about 160 children, and they're using that space very flexibly for formal and informal learning purposes. And it was very impressive because that school, sorry, I've done the wrong thing there, really did seem to work. Now, in another school, the same design principles were embedded in the building. So having different open spaces, more closed spaces, very careful thought about the flow of people through that building. And yet, when we started to look at the building, here is a wall, and the head teacher had built new walls because claiming that open spaces weren't good for the children to live in. But what was very interesting was that these were all in one smallish town in the southeast of England. So the children who went to this school and the children who went to this school could very often come from the same family, but different accounts were given about whether or not the spaces were suitable for them. In this school, they decided that they needed to go back to the traditional style of design, and that's what they did. Maybe not quite as radically as in this school, where the design was of a very beautiful, big, large open space with lots of smaller hubs off it, allowing for large collective activities and smaller, more focused activities. In this school, about almost $2 million American dollars were spent retrofitting smaller spaces. So these glass panels here were put in afterwards, actually put in complete ignorance of the way in which ventilation worked in the school. And the larger spaces were carved up into smaller spaces again. Again, the argument was, we can't work in that way. There was no attempt in these settings to learn how to work differently. It was only in a setting where there was a conscious attempt to learn a new form of practice and to understand that design and practice are kind of inevitably tightly bound up with each other. And this, at its worst, in this very interesting design with mini schools around a big central area, which had a lot of very exciting features. But when we looked at what had gone on, they weren't able to draw on large amounts of money. So what the teachers did was to drag furniture around to break up the spaces. And of course, what you have there is the physical aspects of the space were broken up, but the acoustics were disastrous. So the sound from one area to another would flow over and around these bits of furniture. And the overall effect was a dysfunctional environment for learning. Our research showed very clearly that for innovation to take place with transformation of design, there has to be a very conscious approach to learning how to use that design in practice. Now, the other thing that I think we want to talk about today is is about furniture and the way in which we need to think fairly carefully about how we not only design the fabric of the building, but also the furniture that's placed within it. So if we ask what the workplace is doing, it's getting better at collaborating. If you look at Google, Apple, the big multinational companies, they're designing their workplaces for very flexible work. So people, I mean, I think it's Apple who talk about nests where their workers work in areas which are highly personalized, and with a lot of emphasis on sharing ideas. Well, one of the problems is that tradition has been rows of children facing the front, which is with desks like this, which are good for didactic work, but really appalling for collaborative work. And then we had the sort of sitting around a round desk, which is great for collaborative work. But if you want the children actually to listen to something that the teacher is saying to the whole group, which will happen, then actually those round tables are not effective at all. Quite a simple design of table and chairs allows you to do both, to have good didactic and good collaborative spaces. And this is the sort of example of that.
Professor Daniels,
yes.
We just want to be mindful of time. And so we'll have a couple of minutes before we switch to Dr. Ming, whom I also need to introduce. Please.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
I just finish by showing that these principles of design can be used in university settings where the lecture theatre inhibited collaborative learning, and that the conclusions our conclusions are that design's a social practice, that there's a mutual shaping of design and practice, and that practice deflects and directs attention to particular aspects of design. If you want to bring Hao-Ming in now, that would be good.
Thank you very much, Professor Daniels. Hello?
Hello, thank you. I'm sorry, I was a bit confused about what was happening there.
Oh, no. Did you want to add anything else?
I'm sorry?
Did you want to add anything else?
I think I've made the main points.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Daniels. And I do apologize. I thought Professor Ming was also presenting with you, but just to briefly mention that Professor Ming is a research fellow in the department and external advisor for the group of national experts on effective learning environment at the OECD and Department of Education at the UK. So this is a joint work of Professor Daniels and Professor Ming Tse. And Professor Ming Tse is going to be here with us for the questions and answers. She's a qualified architect who's been educated at Bath, Cambridge, and the Architectural Association in London. Contemporary architecture's radical approach and multidisciplinary agenda continue to influence Professor Ming's work. Her research aims to gather empirical evidence on the impact of design on students' engagement, as we have clearly seen in the joint presentation of Dr. Daniels and Dr. Ming Tse. So we will be reaching out to you in a little bit, Dr. Ming, to ask you some questions. Right now, we're going to be moving on to our next guest, who is Ms. Kalthoum Ali Salim, who is the GEMS of Education's Chief Strategic Partnership Officer. She plays a key role in strengthening the organization's position and championing its mission and goals, both in the UAE and internationally, through the development of new and existing relationships and partnerships across the public and private sectors. Prior to joining GEMS Education, Ms. Kalthoum worked at Dubai's Knowledge and Human Development Authority, where she held senior leadership positions, including Executive Director of Education Development and Director of Institutional Development. Over the course of more than 10 years at KHDA, she led the government's body unified strategy to attract, retain, and enhance the quality of private education provision in Dubai, and was also responsible for the development of laws and guidelines governing all private K-12 schools in the Emirates. So with that, we're going to give the floor to you, Ms. Kalthoum. We've heard, of course, the model presented by Dr. Kudin. We've also heard some reflection on the schools of the future by Dr. Daniels and Dr. Ming, whom actually presented the physical environment in which the schools of the future would need to operate. Although I must say, and I do have a burning questions, Dr. Daniels and Dr. Ming, about how do they see these physical propositions or proposals of schools of the future, given the recent developments in the world and the pandemic and social distancing and all of that. So, and I'm sure they've thought about that and they'll be able to share their views on that in a little bit. But for now, Dr. Kulthum, Ms. Kulthum, we're all ears. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Thank you, دكتورة هنا. شاكرة للفريق والمركز الإقليمي for this opportunity, and thanks for all the speakers. Really an amazing presentation just now on the design and the impact on learning. I really appreciate the report as well. I think a lot of the findings in the report were actually music to my ears, because they talks about the comprehensive areas where you need to consider when it's talking about the learning, and how can we prepare the generation for the future that a lot of us don't know how it will look like. I think today I will be sharing some of my perspective concerning the future of learning and what are the things that we need to consider. Maybe I'll start with highlighting a couple of points, and then I will share with you a slide kind of organizing or explaining how the future of the schools would look like in terms of practice. So I know, I think all of us are aware, the beginning of, the main purpose of education is always, ensure that every child or every learning is learning something new every day, is becoming a better person. At the same time, when we look at the inception of education, it started to actually graduate students who will be working in factories and farms. At the moment, we know that the futures of learning are not graduating students who will be working on those companies only or those factories. They will be actually contributing to the knowledge economy of their own countries or the world. So the way the education for those individuals would need to look different to what it used to be. So for me, I think there are 5 fundamental areas that we always need to consider for the future of learning. I think number 1, we need to start with changing the mindset that education is not a single responsibility of a school or a teachers. It's basically a shared responsibility, which I think the report have highlighted this point by saying it's something that's happened in integration with community members, whether that's family, parents, universities, or companies. So that's something we really need to highlight, and how can we sustain the future of learning. I think the second point, we all know that the 50% of the future jobs will not exist now. So we are preparing this youth generation for something that is unknown, which means that we need to focus more onto not the knowledge as we used to do in the old schooling system, but basically on the soft side of things, the skills of the futures, leadership, collaborations, resilience, being able to learn and unlearn, being able to solve problems. These are things that are fundamental for you to continue to play a different roles within the economy or within your sector. Very simple examples. If we look in our daily life, each one of us have a different way of drinking their cup of coffee. Someone would like to have a Turkish, someone would like to have, a Spanish latte, someone would like to have a specialty coffee, and each one of them has a different price and cost. And education should be done the same. I think a lot of differentiated approach have been done in our life on a daily basis, even with our cup of water, type of water that we get. But I think when it's come to the learning, there are, I wouldn't say there isn't, but there are multiple examples of what differentiated education looks like. But I think now we need to take it to another level, because I think students of this generation are more able to lead their own learning. They're not waiting for someone to tell them what do they want to learn. If you ask a student what he wants to learn, he'll tell you what he wants to learn more. And how about a person who's aware of his, I would say, area of improvement, who can share the teacher with their learning needs? I think a fundamental point, which again, the report have highlighted on regulation, policy formation. I think we need to start avoiding input policy formation. It should always be outcome. So we all, as educators, operators, family, community member, are actually driven with an outcome, with a vision, rather than driven of meeting specific regulation, because every school, maybe every community, every child might have a different form of regulation or guidelines. Last but not least, I think we all agree that the future of education should be the title of classroom with no boundaries. Learning should be encouraged and happen at any point of time. It should not be regulated by in a classroom or a physical space. It could happen if I stayed at home. And thanks, I think, to COVID, we've kind of realized this faster than we thought of. I think online schooling becoming more like an option. Parents, I know examples, and I'm sure you would know, and I relate to it to a lot of people who live in countries where fasting is happening. I think we'll start tomorrow. A lot of parents have chosen 1 month of online schooling during Ramadan. They're happy to support their kids. It is an option that they can choose now. It was impossible, I would say, last year or the year before. But now it's becoming a choice. And I think maybe this year, because COVID is still on, it's based on request. But I think in the future, it could be on an offer. So again, those kind of things encourage learning to take place at any point of time. I think last but not least, I'll just share with you a slide. Just 1 second. Are you able to see?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so this slide basically explains how the schooling looks like now. It's in a school building. There is a specific schedule we need to follow in a classroom. There is a fixed curriculum, whether it's in math or English or PE, and outcomes that we need to reach. And there's only one path. If you are in UK, you graduate with A-level. Yes, there is a BTEC, but very much customized to a curriculum rather than to a passion. I'm optimistic that in 2022, we will see more of this because it's really happening around the world. There is the blue schools in the US, there is the green school in Bali, there is the character school in the UK, and all of them don't see education as a school physical building, but actually the world as a campus. There is an emerge in terms of schedule, there is an integrated studies and thematic learning, and they started to actually recognize multiple pathways to learning. But I think for us to prepare the generation for a knowledge economy, we need to go to achieve what we're aiming to in 2071, achieving the vision of this country of ensuring that every student is successful in their own passion and their own area. And here, it's basically a reflection of what the report have said, and I'm sure the speaker will agree on personalized learning. A learning of agencies, working with university and work entry, not waiting for the graduation to happen for you to join those places, or those platforms. I think on the second slide, just briefly, it tells you what are the knowledge domain, and it's a totally new way of looking at learning. It's not by subject. Okay, what's new to us? Definitely, coding, artificial intelligence, data sciences. These are new things, but should be incorporated in our new system. Personal things, I don't think it's happening across all curriculum, but I think it's starting, we see example of it, which is basically about initiative. Curiosity, character development are very important because we've seen it when we work now in our professional career. Social, definitely being able to communicate with people, understanding the wider community, not only your own community. And then when we talk about knowledge, we don't talk about it in terms of math and science, but basically communication system. So connecting all verbal intelligence and non-verbal in under one umbrella. Mathematics, it's a numerical and computing system. So how can we link both together? Social system, thought system, and life system. So basically linking biology, ecology to how it's related to our life. Performing system when it's become to art and design. So these are like some of the thoughts that I wanted to share, with the wider audience today. And happy, to welcome any questions or comments on that.
Thank you, Ms. Kaltoum. Thank you very much for this exciting presentation. I think you brought up very important and interesting points, particularly your point on the purpose of schooling, for example, today, and something very interesting, which is the preparing our kids for the unknown, the future. I always thought ministries of education had this crystal ball for which they talk the future, but unfortunately, it's not the reality. Anyway, moving on now to our last guest. who is with us today to comment also on the presentation, Mr. Nadir Zafar, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Alif Education. Mr. Nadir is also a Singapore national, educated from kindergarten to grade 12 in Singapore at some of the top schools there. He's currently pursuing his Doctor of Education at NYU. Mr. Nadir is an education change agent who believes the education sector is ripe for transformation. He has been educated again as to some of the best schools in the world. As Chief Operating Officer at Alif Education, a rapidly growing education technology company that is disrupting the education sector, he carries broad responsibilities, driving business performance and providing leadership over a number of strategic projects. His research focus centers around finding better ways to educate children in the K-12 space. Prior to Alif Education, Mr. Nadir worked at GEMS Education, first at the headquarters in Dubai and then in Singapore as Director of Corporate Development. Mr. Nadir's leadership extends beyond work. He has served at the Singapore community as President of the Singapore Business Council at UAE, and he's taken on leadership roles in several organizations. With that, Mr. Nadir, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind and long introduction. And it's great to have everyone here. The views that I've heard so far are fantastic. And I was asked to comment on the future of schools. And what I wanted to do, and the reason I have this background is because I want to give some sort of a context. I want to talk about something that's probably something that is futuristic, right? And so that's why this background is here. As Dr. Hana said, I am doing my doctorate right now at NYU. And so my views are actually my views also coming from what I do at my doctorate studies. In answering the question, what the future of schools looks like, I'm going to ask you all, the audience, 6 questions. And through these 6 questions, I hope to form ideas in your head on what the future of school would look like. Rather than for me to tell you my views, I want you to form your own views. So these 6 questions, I think, are fundamental to understanding what the future of schools looks like. And the 6 questions are: why are we educating kids? What are we educating kids? Where are we educating them? When are we educating them? Who educates the kids? And how? How do we educate these kids? So let's talk about these 6 questions. And let's talk first about the why. School was made compulsory in 1880 or thereabouts. This is about 150 years ago. And why they put kids in school back then and why they put them in schools today has changed dramatically. 150 years ago is a time when there was no electricity in use, there were no automobiles, no internet, no airplanes. This is a time of agriculture. This is a time where people use gas to light up their homes, they use candles. It was a very different era. The why we've educated kids from then and now has changed. But in the last 10 or 20 years, the why has changed even more pronounced than what it has in the years from 1818 to 1980. In the last 10, 20 years, with the advent of technology, with AI, why we educate kids in this new world has changed dramatically. And yet the education system remains teaching kids the same things, which leads me to the what. What are we educating kids? And the what needs a serious rethink. Because what we should be educating kids is a lot, but what we actually educate them and what we actually test them on in schools is only this, a very narrow spectrum of what they really should be educated. We're not testing them on their empathy, on their integrity, on things that really matter, their leadership, their entrepreneurship. These are not things that we test them or teach them as much as we teach them about English, math, science, languages, art. I mean, these traditional subjects have been a carry forward from the 1950s, and we continue to teach the kids the same things as though these are the only things that determine a kid's smartness or not. And that's wrong, because what we educate kids has to change with the times. We're in a world of AI. We're in a world that needs people who have good collaborative skills, who are good leaders, who are good entrepreneurs, who are creative. And yet schools are continuing to teach the same old thing. And I'm going to point at just one topic, one subject, and it's a controversial one. Let's talk about languages. Now, languages are taught in schools because it helps in brain development. Research proves that languages are very important for brain development. However, playing football, learning music, doing art, these are also very good for brain development. And yet students are continuing to be told through the education system that we value one of these subjects, but not the others. Playing football, it may, it may help your brain development, make you more physically fit, but it's a language that matters more than that. Language matters more than art. But why is that? So I think we need to rethink the what we teach kids. Let's move on to the third thing. Where do we educate kids? And in the past, it's always been a physical construct of a building. But as we progress to the new world, we have to consider, does it have to be a building? Why does school have to look like a school? Why is it always this boring, drab building? Did you know that the interior design of a school helps in your mental health? It helps in your brain stimulation. The design even affects your behavior. So why can't we come up with something much more creative in a school? Why must a school look like a school? Why can't we have a school that looks like a spaceship, for example? I'm just throwing these ideas out, but it's time that we break away from a school being a school, a block, a building, a lobby, classrooms. We have to think outside of the box. And I think in one of the earlier panelists' speech, he did share some very good ideas on how a school could look. Which brings me to the fourth question: when do we teach kids? And again, this question is something that 150 years ago doesn't apply anymore. 150 years ago, they started school in September because in May, June, and July, the kids at that time were busy in the factories or the fields where they had to do agricultural work. And so they started school in September so that they could allow kids to do their work and then get to school. Today, 150 years later, we still start school in September. And the reality is we can start school anytime, any place. It doesn't have to be September. It doesn't have to be January. It could be any time that you are willing and ready to start. Last two questions. The who. Who teaches kids? In the old days, it had to be a human teacher who was was qualified to teach. But the who has changed. Education applications have replaced teachers in languages across many countries. It's not just the EdTech applications that are replacing teachers. It's also AI-powered learning platforms. It's also your parents who are helping you teach. It's also your friends who are teaching you. It's not just the teacher that we rely on for that source of knowledge. Today, because of the internet, because everyone has access to knowledge, we can learn from any multiple number of sources. And it doesn't only have to be physical human teachers with certificates. The last question, the how. How we educate kids back before and how we educate them in the future is going to change dramatically, again, with the advent of AI. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same old system of you all have to learn the same thing at the same time. I think in the future, as also our previous speaker said, it's all about personalized learning. It's all about learning at your own pace, learning at your own level, and really focusing on the learning as opposed to just passing exams. So I think with these 6 questions that I've shared with you, you can now form ideas on how the future of schooling should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nadir, and thank you so much for our esteemed panelists. I think you've given us quite a lot to think of in terms of schools of the future. We've also received quite interesting questions from the audience. So what I'm going to do during our last 12 minutes is I'm going to share some of those questions in addition to my questions also with the panelists, and then we'll give a couple of minutes for each to kind of respond to the question they see most fit. So we'll try to do this in 2 iterations. So for the first round, I think, one question that I would like to address to all of the panelists is, again, you presented quite interesting models, quite interesting ideas, whether to the physical environment or to the pedagogy, teachers and whatnot. But I ask you, for whom is this? For whom are these models that you are presenting, given that we do not have, the same context across all countries? I mean, some countries, whether in the West or in the Emirates, for example, if we're talking about the Arab world, may actually have the privilege of moving forward in such designs, such approaches, such training and whatnot. I mean, Ms. Kulthum, you mentioned, for example, that some parents may choose for their kids to go online during Ramadan. Unfortunately, in some countries, it's not a choice, right, to even go to school. So bearing this in mind, when we talk about schools for the future or of the future, who is this addressing? And how can we actually adapt such ambitious models that you've talked about, all of you, including Dr. Claudine, to the different contexts, especially in the Arab world? I mean, one of the questions from the audience actually was, how would this, be adapted given the challenges that we have in the Arab world? So, in a sense that, what are your future projections for future schools in Arab region, putting into consideration all the conflicts and challenges that we have in that context? So this is the first really big question. The other question is, again, you talk about, the key to the education, to these also changes, of course, are the different stakeholders whom will have to play new roles in a sense, but key to that is the teacher. And so how do you project teacher education, the preparation of teachers for that in a sense? And I'll keep the other questions for later on. So we'll start with these two. Dr. Claudine, would you like to go first? And then we'll go in the same order that the presenters went. Just 1 minute, if you may.
Okay, sure. Well, I think that one of the aspects I can address is certainly in terms of challenges. So of course, one of the concerns we have is that some places can afford AI and technological advancement, whereas other places can't. But in some ways, having this type of system actually allows for more flexibility in the sense that all you need is one internet connection. So if you've got, and you can have many people use it and work off of that. So in that respect, it actually offers a little bit more flexibility. And I think that just like with any other endeavors, just like with medical supplies or anything else, I think that we can start looking at some countries helping others as well. But even if that's not possible, then again, just one internet connection gives you access to the whole world. So I think that would be a possibility for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Claudine. I think in some countries, this one internet connection is a wishful thinking. But anyway, I do understand that we can do very little with a lot with very little. Professor Harry?
I think there's a danger that the online systems will lead to a significant rise in individualized approaches to learning. And what we've been seeing is that there's much more interest in collaborative learning. In the work Hao-Ming and I have done, what emerged very powerfully from the young people was they wanted social spaces for learning. In other words, places where they could where they could work with each other and talk with each other about what they were working on, and that seemed to be associated with both better well-being as well as better cognitive outcomes. And I think the internet will have an obvious place, but if it dominates, I have a concern that collaborative approaches will be eroded. I know there's an answer to that you can do collaboration over these new platforms, but the evidence, certainly in the UK at the moment, is that children have not fared well in terms of their well-being when they were using online systems alone.
Thank you very much, Professor Harry. And I think we all agree that learning is a social act, and so this is at the heart. Collaboration is at the heart of that, especially for the future. Professor Ming?
I wanted to add to Harry's point that during COVID, what head teachers and students have been telling us more than anything is that the bricks and mortars of school actually matter more than ever. And they're more important because they're where the community is. And as Harry said, that in our pre-COVID data collection, what we found when we asked students what was the most important component of the school environment to them, that was about social relationships. Student to student, student to teacher to teacher relationships. And as Harry said, so going on, we need to really think about how the schools of the future, how do we design schools that really cultivate and promote and nurture positive social relations? Because you can do a lot of the education online, as we know during COVID, but how do you really do that in a physical environment? And how do you teach and learn collaborative skills? I think that's really the most important point.
Thank you very much, Professor Ming. I think this goes straight to Ms. Kalthoum's, approach to issues of skills of the future. Over to you, Ms. Kalthoum.
Thank you. Look, I don't have a specific answer, especially to countries maybe we're struggling with technology. But I think one of the key things, and I think we both agree on, a lot of the speakers, is collaboration. I think the Uber of learning should be installed in our schools. How can we Uberize learning, where I can teach my kids in my country, and then maybe how can this be Uberized to another country so they learn from it, whether it's through the online platform. A simple example is before we wanted to support some schools with video of classroom, model classrooms. We couldn't because none of them are recorded. Now we have a wealth of classroom that really are teaching great skills and areas that could be accessible by people who are not able to access highest quality of education. So I think collaboration and Uberization of learning, that's a fundamental thing that we need to adopt. And maybe back to Mr. Nader's questions, if we go back to why now we need to learn, what are we preparing those generation? And if those mindsets have been changed from a single, teacher in a very expensive school, or a teacher in a camp, who really are teaching people who are, for example, disabled or disadvantaged. If they understand the main purpose of learning, I think they will be able to install this collaborative social working and install the new skills of learning. So I think sometimes it's not about trying to bring the technology, which is important, but sometimes maybe going back to what really is the fundamental purpose of learning. It will shift, I think, a lot of the learning that's happening on those platforms.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kalthoum. You clearly highlight that bridge between, schooling and the future, which will actually be our last point to touch upon. Mr. Nadir, over to you with some concluding remarks.
I'm so glad that we all agree here on this panel that collaboration is one of the most critical skills we need for our students. And yet our education system does not support that, because when you have kids in school, they have to do exams alone. They have to sit for their examinations and do that examination alone. That's not the way we teach kids outside of school, because we believe that it's not necessary for everybody to have all of the knowledge in their own heads. It's about collaboration, working with other people to get the solution to the problems that we face. And so I think that's something the education system really needs to change, is this whole insistence that everybody must be great at math, everybody must be great at science, at English, and languages. That's not necessary. I think collaboration, as we've all agreed, that's key.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nadir. So we have a couple of minutes before we close, and I don't want to take up all that time, of course. I'd rather listen to you guys. Just to say that, yes, collaboration is essential, but I also believe that, just like in sports, you have individualized sports, you have group sports and whatnot. I think the individual is also important in terms of the worth of the individual. But to close on, so what is one last idea that you would like to reflect as the future of, schools, or the schools of the future, in terms of the Arab world, given the challenges of the pandemic that are going to be with us for the few years to come, perhaps, I don't know, just one quick idea. Dr. Claudine?
Thank you. I think the main idea that I think is quite important is really just the idea to develop these social skills and empathy. I think that if we start being able to understand and looking at others in a more comprehensive way, then that'll just, it'll foster people helping people and really that collaborative spirit that we're talking about.
Professor Harry, thank you.
Thank you. You asked about the pandemic and the designs after I'd spoken. All those designs that we looked at that under building schools for the future consisted of mini schools, schools within schools, so spaces within the overall school, which were the territory, if you like, of smaller groups of young people. They weren't moving around a vast building, dragging their books with them. They were working with a set group of teachers in a smaller space. So in other words, mimicking what's being done in schools in the UK at the moment with the so-called bubbles. In other words, keeping smaller social groups together who can be, where the safety can be more likely, can't be completely assured. But that idea of the big factory school being changed into the smaller groups of family units, if you like, within the one school.
Thank you very much, Professor Harry. Professor Ming?
Thank you. I want to add that in our data, we looked at lots of schools that started really thinking about what a community means in its physicality. And a lot of schools had spaces called heart spaces. And I think, especially with COVID, and it kind of transcends cultural barriers, but the idea of trying to nurture a sense of belonging and safety, and how we do that through heart spaces or schools within schools, but how we actually kind of promote those relationships, informal and formal, within schools.
Thank you very much, Professor Ming. And this is, I think, still so much applicable even online. Ms. Kalthoum, last words.
I think the success of any learning and for every student should not only be determined by his academic capabilities. It should be a collective of his outcome and his academic capabilities, plus his soft skills, which are everything we've talked about: social relationship, collaboration, empathy, sympathy, all those important soft skills that they need for their future. And I think in every relationship, whether it was professional or personal. Last but not least, their interest in art or in design or in sport. So I think the new definition of what successful learner is a collective of doing not extremely well in everything, but at least a representation of areas that related to academic, soft skills, and interests. I think that's the future of success with me.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kalthoum. Mr. Nadir?
I believe we should give students the power to choose what they want to learn and let them follow their interests, because not everyone has to be learning exactly the same thing. In the future of schooling, you're really going to develop what you're interested in. Thank you.
Thank you again. I mean, the panelists have summed up the discussion very nicely. But just to close, I think, we gather very well that the issue of psychosocial well-being, collaboration, and community is very essential in schools of the future. And I think, moving forward, what the pandemic has really given us, I know the discussion is not the pandemic, but it tends to hijack a lot of discussions. It has actually pushed us out of our comfort zones as educators, as researchers, as policymakers, as parents. I think to think of what could be done that we haven't done before, and what we need to do actually to accommodate kids all over the world in any context possible, and to make use of things that we might have taken for granted in the past, or things that we haven't explored, like technology, for example, in terms of what it can lend us for the future. Thank you very much again for our panelists. Thank you for ARSEP for hosting this. And Ms. Mahra, would you like to say anything in the closing?
Thank you, Dr. Hannah, for moderating this session. I think it's great effort from your side, and I'm thankful for our experts to share their experience in this session. I read a lot of comments from the participation. They have very positive feedback. And Dr. Claudine, thank you for sharing the presentation with us. I will speak in Arabic now. أنا أشكركم جميعاً على مشاركتكم في هذه الجلسة النقاشية، وأشكر الدكتورة هنا على إدارتها للنقاش بصورة رائعة، وأشكر الدكتورة كلودين للتقديم العرض الخاص بالورقة، وأشكرهم أيضاً كلية الإمارات للتطوير التربوي على العمل والشراكة الاستراتيجية مع المركز، وبإذن الله تستمر هذه الشراكة والاستراتيجية، وأيضاً المؤسسات التي شاركت معنا هذه أيضاً نتمنى أن تستمر الشراكة بيننا والعمل المشترك لمصلحة التعليم ليس في دولة الإمارات فقط ولكن في كل الدول العربية. أشكركم وشكرا لكم.
Please can we have a group picture before we are going? Thank you. We'll say 3, 2, 1, cheese. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye everyone.
شكرا. Bye-bye. Thanks.